Good morning, folks. Good morning, everyone, and I particularly have to welcome Frank number 1 back. Good to see you, brother, Nanette, Marcia. Of course, Larry and SMA were last week, and just makes you feel good all over, doesn't it? Apologize for running behind a little bit. I was still going through my Easter basket. But it's good to see everyone and to be encouraged. And you know, it's kind of like Easter and Christmas. I call those teachable moments. You know, in Easter, sometimes we had to explain that we celebrated every Sunday the death, burial, and resurrection of our Savior. And it's a great opportunity, as we will hear in just a little while in our worship. And we're grateful for that, for the church and for this good church family. Any thing that has changed recently, anyone that we need to, I know we have lots of folks we need to remember in our prayers, but anyone that we have not mentioned, Ron?
Sharon's down with irregular bowel syndrome.
Huh.
She's wiped out.
We're so sorry. Sharon's had a tough time, so let's please remember Sharon.
Larry Elbridge notified us that they found a 2-centimeter growth in his left kidney. So the 14th, he's supposed to have more testing.
So this is Larry.
Larry Elbridge.
Yeah, okay. So sorry. We were praying for his brother just recently. And so now with Larry. So let's please remember Larry. Okay. This is Art, and Edwina's daughter is back in the hospital again, and we'll try to get this in the bulletins, or Amy can put it in the announcements too. Room 1130. Is that the local hospital, Piedmont here? Or?
Up in Brazelton.
Where? Brazelton? The Brazelton Hospital. So she's also having some stomach problems, it looks like there, and still running tests. So let's please remember Art and Edwina's daughter too. Amy?
Harry Sims' sister is in hospice. Her name is Nina Jones.
Lena?
Nina, Nina Jones.
Lena Jones in hospice.
Right.
This is Perry's sister there. And I know there are many others that we remember. Just want to encourage you to look at your bulletins and the announcements that we get. And Causey, good to see you back, brother. And did you take care of things in St. Louis? Did you see the arch? Just barely. That's great. That's great. Pray with me, please. Father, we thank you for the beauty of this day and for this opportunity now that we can come together to study from your word, and as we look forward to our worship today, and to remember the gift of your Son. And always, Father, giving thanks to thee that we can approach your throne, and as we remember those that have been mentioned, help us to help where we can, Father, and also as we turn to thee for your healing hand. Be with us, keep us strong, keep us well. In your Son's name, amen. What are we studying? Joshua. All right. We where we're in chapters 11 and 12, and we'll look at that and start looking at that, just review that right quick in a few minutes. But this morning I want to start out with geography lessons. Geography was always a favorite thing of mine, because I remember in school I wasn't sure if I'd get out of the county or not, so I loved to watch it. One of the things I remember so well, studying history and geography and the Great Wall of China, and I'd then stand on the Great Wall, just never think about those things. But Joshua, it helps us so much to look at the maps and look and see what has occurred from that standpoint. Again, as we continue to look, the Holy Land today, and my manager told me that I wasn't pointing over here either, so I'll turn both ways to see too. But this is the Holy Land today. And notice we talked about the other day, we talk about Gaza a lot, and Gaza is still one of those places that have difficulties. And then this morning I read in Jordan, which always had a pretty good relationships there. Looks like Jordan is having some problems. I don't know whether they've taken the king out yet, but they think there might be a coup or something there in Jordan. And we read a lot about Syria. Lebanon is still a pretty much safe place to go, and Syria is not too bad. I know we see that in the news a whole lot. But these are the areas. We talk about the West Bank. Now you can still travel up and down through the West Bank and through the areas there, and some of the towns that we've looked at. But again, that's what it looks like today. Now, again, we've talked about, as we started back, and we talked about the journeys to the Promised Land. And this, I want to point this out. And here, when we talk about the east side or the Transjordan, sometimes in your scripture you see the Transjordan, or it speaks of the east side of the River Jordan in this area here. Now, Kadesh Barnea, we're talking, this lines here is when Moses was still. And we'll read about in some of the chapters later on, we'll read about some of the areas over on this east side, the Transjordan, that where Moses was still in command there. And a lot of this area, the east side, was taken over. And so again, we see this route here from the southern part, then it came on around, and then right on up, took over these areas here. And then actually Moses died right here just outside. And then as we read on. So this is the journey to the Promised Land that they went. And again, just remember when we start reading and studying in some later chapters, that these are the areas that talk about that Moses and all the cities. We read those paragraphs and you just got cities after each other. So that's the journeys to the Promised Land, and then where Moses died. Can you see that, Mary Lynn? Okay. All right. Then we have the boundaries of the Promised Land that were set out. Now here's down in Kadesh Barnea where Moses was. And then as they set those boundaries out, then these are areas in that when Moses was still, they took this area on. And we read a lot about that because then some of that was given. We've already talked a little bit about that with that. And of course now, as we just showed earlier, we got Jordan and up to Syria and Lebanon and those areas there. But this is the Promised Land that we read about earlier. And then when we started out, then when Joshua took over, again we saw this, but just a little better picture here, where they crossed the River Jordan there. And then they set up camp there in Gilgal, and they were in Gilgal for a long time. And we'll read when they move out of Gilgal as other things go along. And then, of course, Jericho, we studied about Jericho and the walls came tumbling down. Then we know of the difficulty in in Bethel in this area here. But here's a pretty good picture there of the Dead Sea. And then going on up to the Sea of Galilee there. Then we'll be reading about the tribal allotments there on the Transjordan side. We read about Reuben, Gad, and Manasseh, and then all the other tribes on this side. And that's where we're beginning there. Of course, we talked about the conquest here, and that's where we'll review here in just in a minute the southern campaign and the northern campaign. And that's just another picture. Again, this is kind of a picture there where it came on through in all these towns there where the southern campaigns went on. Then we went on up to the northern campaigns, as we'll talk about here just in a few minutes. Again, just a better one that shows so many towns. Some of them are still there. Gaza's still there. Some of them are still there. Some of them are not there anymore. But again, so many places that we read about. I went through that real quick. Any questions or statements on those maps or things we look? We'll keep looking over and over, but just wanted us to see and to feel good about what we're looking at and what's occurring from that standpoint. Okay, and as we see there, then the conquest of Canaan is summarized in these verses from chapter 11 through chapter 12. And again, I think we talked a little bit about this last week. How many cities made peace with the Israelites? One. Only one made peace there. And we read the story about that. What city was that?
Gibeon.
What?
Gibeon.
Gibeon. How about, you pronounce it that? How about Hebron? I could pronounce it Hebron. Hebron, and then the people there in Hebron were called the Hivites there. And we know the story, we read the story about the Hivites. What happened to the Hivites? They became what? Became slaves, the servants to them. And we'll read that later on in some other chapters about some of the other cities where they became slaves or servants there. And again, we've looked at the picture there talking about describing the areas occupied by Israel. Then in this section it talks about the entire conquest of Canaan that we've just looked at, including the takeover of the Central Highlands, the southern and the northern campaigns, all of these particular areas that we want to look at. Again, the last 8 verses of chapter 11 recount the conquest of how the Lord enabled the Israelites to be victorious. Again, we talked about a while ago that not a city made peace except the inhabitants, the Hivites, the inhabitants of Gibeon. Well, I said Hebron, it was Gibeon. Excuse me. Why didn't someone correct me?
That was Mary.
Beg pardon?
That was Mary that said that.
You got a gold star today. So it's Gibeon there. And then all the others they took in battle there. And again, we see the number of cities that were taken there. So again, we go through these things so fast there, but just like last week, we're reminded this campaign just wasn't done overnight. It took years. And in fact, here this commentary talks about at least 7 years passed from the crossing of the River Jordan to the capture of Hebron. And of course, we know at this particular time, the people were living at Gilgal. And we're going to talk about that. That gets to be a problem. We're going to talk about that a little bit later on, too, about the people living in Gilgal there. So again, did take some time for that. Chapter 12 lists the kings defeated by the Hebrews. You can read that. There's a bunch of them, as you read, as they took over the cities. It talks about all the kings, of course, because every city or area there had a king. So there were plenty of kings there. And this, as I mentioned to you a while ago, verses 1 through 6 of chapter 12 talks about the areas that Moses took over. And most of that, again, that area was on the Transjordan side, on the east side, before Moses died, that they took over those cities and over those areas. And so in chapter 12, too, we find out then that substantially at rest from the war, Israel was now ready to establish itself in the nation and in the promised land there. So all of these battles through the southern campaign that we read about, through the northern campaign, taking over the kings and all the areas there, and so those particular places we're talking about there. So mentions of all the kings there that were taken over in chapter 12 there. All the kings. Any statements or questions on chapters 11 or 12? Again, those are just reviews. The northern campaign and southern campaign, they're ready. So again, they're resting there at Gilgal. They're now ready to establish itself as a nation in the promised land. So they've got this territory that God promised them on the east side, on the west side, and ready to take over there. And so those are the areas in that we want to continue to look at.
Got a question, Frank.
Yes, sir.
At the time that Joshua was coming across the Jordan and everything, the tribes hadn't really been established at that time, had it? Not, divided up.
Oh, no. That comes on. In fact, we got a lot of these next chapters talks about how they divided up those tribes. And it was, I started to say it wasn't easy to divide them up, but some of the people weren't happy about it too. So that's very important. That's what we're really coming into now as we're ready to move on to that. And so again, as we've looked at this map a lot, as we just talked about, again, we've talked about the southern campaign, we've talked about the northern campaign. This area was already taken over. Moses, again, in those first 6 chapters of chapter 12, had already taken this area over on the Transjordan side. And so all of these cities and towns and kings and so forth, again, were in that particular area there. And again, the same way, this map just kind of points out the towns a little bit better through that. And we're going to talk a lot about towns later on too, dealing with some particular situations there. All right, now this is what we're beginning to seek. This is what it's supposed to look like when it gets through. Again, on the Transjordan side, Reuben, Gad, and Manasseh, and there were Manasseh on both sides there. Again, the Transjordan side, this was the property, the areas that we read about, and it talks about the boundaries and all the cities and things that are in that particular area. And again, it gets complicated as you read in the scriptures there, is that you find out that there's some cities might be in one tribal area that's really run by another tribe. So again, a lot of interesting things in that particular situation. But we'll look at this a great deal as we move on. In chapter 13, he says, not all the land was occupied and possessed. So they just gone through, we just read about these northern campaigns and these southern campaigns, but then he tells us that, that some of it had not been taken over yet. So there were still some areas there that remained to be conquered. In verses 1 through 6 of chapter 13, it talks about the remaining land that needs to be conquered. And it's kind of interesting as you read chapter 13, verse 1. Now Joshua was old. And surely we know that, of course, Joshua went through the wilderness and again went through all of this. So you're old in advanced years, but there remains very much land yet to be possessed. So they still, even with these northern and southern campaigns, they still a lot of it that they need to take over. And talks about all the territory of the Philistines. We'll look at this current one, but the Philistines are pretty much down this area here, even when we talk about Gaza. A lot of this area right in here still. And so then there were little areas all over that still hadn't been, as you can, as you read there, in those particular area. This is a land that yet remains, all the territory of the Philistines, that of the Jezreelites. And it talks about from Sihor, which is east of Egypt, and all those areas. You can read about that in those particular areas there. So, but I think the important thing, look on down to verse 6. All the inhabitants of the mountains from Lebanon, and we know Lebanon is already way on up here now, then coming on down, all the area there, as far as the brook of Mespruth, all the Sidonians, I will drive them out before the children of Israel. God is saying, I'll help you. We're going to drive these people out. So they still had this land to conquer, but they had God's help in that particular situation there. And then this is very important too. Listen to this carefully now. Then I will drive them out before the children of Israel, only divided by lot. I'm looking at Joshua 13, verse 6. Only divided by lot to Israel as an inheritance, as I have commanded you. Verse 7, I therefore divide this land as an inheritance to the 9 tribes and half the tribe of Manasseh. All right, now when he talks about 9 tribes, we're talking about on the west side. These other 3 are actually with Manasseh there, are on this side here. And so then with the tribes as they were divided out in this particular situation. And how did he tell them to divide it out? By lot. And we can have a lot of discussions about lot there. And this is mentioned as we read on through chapters 13 and on. We see that discussed on several ways. But all of these tribes, as Art just mentioned a while ago, they're down here in Gilgal, but they still were not sure about where they were going to be. And then by lot, and as we start reading in these next chapters, then as all of this area begins to divide up by lot. And again, who and we'll read that later on, who handled the lot? I can't think of his name right now. We'll look at him. And one of the priests, one of the high priests and Joshua and so forth, as the tribes went in for that. But so there was land that was still left to be possessed there. Yes, good, thank you. And we'll talk about him later on too. Okay, talks about, told them to take it over there in verse 13:7. He says, now divide the inheritance. In verse 7 is what it's talking about here. Told them to command to divide it. So as they take it over, all of this then as they move on with it. The settlement east of the Jordan, we've already looked at that. Of course, that's the side on the Transjordan side that the scriptures also would talk about there, and it talks about the geographical boundaries there. We also looked and we see the tribes there of that Moses had pointed this out to these people who received the land east of the Jordan, and again, what groups of people were not driven out of the land. Some of the Jezreelites or some of the Amorites, I don't know. A number of those people were not driven out. As we're going to read, as you read these chapters, you're going to find a lot of these people that they didn't defeat, and they lived among them and things of that particular nature. So there were several then of groups like that. What tribe received no inheritance in the land? The Levites. And why did they not receive anything? All right, they were supported by the others. Excuse me.
Spend all their energy in the priesthood.
I'm sorry.
Spend other. Spend all their energies serving God.
Also, we'll read several places in here about the Levites, and we'll also read about the cities. But there are a lot of cities. We won't attempt to try to point out where the Levites. What do you think they did with the Levites? Now, we're talking about the priestly tribe. Now, not all the Levites were priests. Like Bobby, I believe we discussed that Wednesday night, didn't we, or something? And so not all of them were priests. But how do you think, and we'll read later on about that, but just tell me offhand, how do you think the Levites how'd they pick out cities for them?
Cities of refuge or?
No, we're talking about Levites. Okay. Cities of refuge, a little bit different. We'll talk about that a little later too. 48 of them. 48 cities that the Levites had, and they also talk about the common land that they had. Now,
what about the cities of refuge? Does that come into play there?
Yeah, well, no, not in this case. We'll talk about cities of refuge. That comes up in another. And there weren't very many cities of refuge. I think 6 cities of refuge come to mind. But the Levites, and we'll talk about it. I think someone said 48 cities, but you still haven't answered my question. Where do you think these 48 cities were?
They were throughout all of it.
Right.
And they had so many miles out from the center of the city.
Okay. I think somewhere I read it, and we might look at it again, how far they were, because the Levites, the cities that they gave them, were within all the tribes, because all the tribes needed priests. So those 48 cities, if you went through and read them, you'll find them in all 12 of those areas on the east side and the west side then. So these cities that were given them. Tom?
So each tribe had a city of Levites?
Each tribe had probably more than one city. Again, as I said, I think in the scripture or something it tells that you didn't want to be very far from it, so it was not a very long. Again, one of the things let me emphasize too, and talking about the cities of refuge, Israel is not that big a country. So I mean, it doesn't. They did a lot of walking and so forth at that time, but it was not a great distance from one place to the other. So it's more convenience to get to those particular areas there. And so again,
I just wondered, as these areas got settled, where did the Ark of the Covenant, where did that stay? Did it stay in different places?
We're gonna talk about that too. That comes in later, but let me just answer your question. In Shiloh, we're gonna talk about that. They go to Shiloh, and a lot of things begin to happen at Shiloh. And I want to say for about 400 years, the Ark of the Covenant was located in Shiloh. Then, who do you think moved the Ark of the Covenant?
David?
David moved it then to Jerusalem. And as we'll read too in these scriptures too, it's surprisingly in all of this southern and northern campaign, they really didn't take over Jerusalem yet. That really came, I believe we read about that in Judges, before Jerusalem was actually taken over. So Shiloh kind of becomes the central area then for the tabernacle. I was looking last night, and I hope maybe next week or whenever we get to that, is to have an illustration of the tabernacle. Again, we talked about that Wednesday too, I think, Bobby Causey.
We're gonna find out a little later that there were 4 cities for each tribe of Levites.
Four cities in each tribe?
Each tribe.
Okay, that's, 4 times 12. Get it there. So that's thank you, Causey, and that's, again, important there, and didn't have to travel very long.
They didn't necessarily all live in those cities. I mean, they still kind of scattered out.
Yeah. And all as we said too, all the Levites were not priests too. When they talk about, and again, I'm getting ahead a little bit, but that's what we're talking about, Levites. They had the cities and the common land. What do we mean when we talk about common land? When you read in the scriptures about common land, what?
It's like shared,
It's shared.
where the flocks can go.
Okay. It's where the flocks can go. It's where they plant and do things of that nature, where they raise the crops and so forth. So they're saying the Levites, you can also put your sheep out here. You can also do your crops and things of that nature out from the cities and so forth then that they had. So in that common land there. Very good. Again, all the verses there that talk about then what tribe received no inheritance. We talked about the Levites, what cities were given to the tribe of Reuben. You can read all of those. Balaam mentioned in this chapter. What had Balaam done there?
Was he a false prophet?
I guess you could call him that. What else would you call him? Beg pardon? He was a soothsayer. We can go back at Numbers and other chapters and talked about something that he did was a very serious nature there. And so Balaam then was killed yet from that standpoint there. So after the years of the war and conquest, the land of Canaan finally fell under the control of God's chosen people. Yet there were still vast areas of land to be conquered, and these are listed in verses 1 through 7, and we talked about that earlier, those areas. Again, we talked about the land that's east of the River Jordan. The Transjordan had already been located to Reuben, Gad, and half the tribe of Manasseh. And again, we've got Manasseh on both sides. Who is Manasseh?
Son of Joseph.
One of the sons of Joseph. And we'll read about another son that's on the west side there. But Manasseh, they separate, when you look at the tribal.
Got a question?
On both sides. Yes,
Well,
sir.
how did they split the Manasseh if it's just one son?
Well, that was part of the promise there. Now, it talks about how they divided it up. there. But anyway, they got both sides there. Unless somebody can answer that better, that's the only way I know how to answer that.
The ones that stayed on the west side, were they for grazing land? Weren't they, didn't they want that for grazing land?
Is it east side? I don't remember. I can't answer. I don't remember that one there. But as I think about what that property looks like, east side would be more flat and grazing areas than where Manasseh is. Harry?
What's a half tribe?
The half tribe is Manasseh.
It is.
That's the only one.
But are these cities more or less a complex?
Well, some of the cities, of course, they were given, as you read all those scriptures, these cities were given, and that's the way they really kind of divided out the promised land with all these particular cities. But only way I know how to answer that, yes, they were complex because they had a lot of different, even some of the people they didn't drive out that they should were still left in the city and things of that nature. Is that what you're talking about, Harry?
Well, so the complexes could share common grounds, is what I'm.
Oh, yes. Very much so. You know, it's kind of interesting. I'm trying to remember. I can't think of the term I want to think of. But when I was visiting in Jerusalem, in Israel, and we were in an area that actually was close to the Dead Sea, and along that area down at the foot of the mountains, there were some areas that the Israelites, or the Jews, even at this time, they were villages where they shared. They shared everything. It was a common place there for them. So I don't know whether that's still there or not, but we passed several like that were common areas for the Israelites there.
Right?
Yes, sir.
As this land was divided up, they still did not own it, did they? God only allowed them to live there, but it wasn't there.
I would suppose so, Frank. Again, they became in charge.
Leviticus, what is it? Leviticus 25:23 says, the land shall not be sold forever, for the land is mine, it's God's speaking. But for ye are strangers and sojourners with me.
Okay.
And that would tell me that they didn't own it, they just left.
Yeah, that's a good point, Frank. It's talking about when these tribal areas were divided out, then they couldn't sell them, or so we're going to sell. Gad's going to sell it to Reuben and things of that nature with it. Yeah, good point. Okay. So again, as we talked about, how the allocation of the land that is detailed there in chapter 13. And again, as we see that, here we see West Manasseh has a lot of property in here. You can see there from a geographical standpoint, you got a lot of mountains in area right through here. Now over on this side, it's a little more flat in areas there. But then in East Manasseh, which is now Jordan and Syria, this is the plains, more of a plains area there. So these are the areas that we'll talk about as they were divided up. And again, it's interesting then the way that it was divided. Okay, looking, any questions on chapter 13? Talked about the remaining tribes and so forth. Okay, Joshua 14 talks about the land that is divided west of the Jordan. Of course, the first settlement is done at Gilgal, and we've looked at the map on several times there. At Gilgal, that's just right across the Jordan. After they crossed the River Jordan, they set up their tribe there. And then we talked about how did Joshua, Eleazar, and the heads of the tribes distribute the land? We mentioned it a while ago. They distributed by what? Lots. They distributed the land by lots from that standpoint. And you can see that in chapter 14, verses 1 through 5 there, those areas. And verse 2, their inheritance was by lot, as the Lord had commanded by the hand of Moses for the 9 tribes and the half-tribe. Now the half-tribe, of course, being West Manasseh there. And for Moses had given the inheritance of the 2 tribes and the half-tribes on the other side of the Jordan, but to the Levites he had given no inheritance. We talked about that. For the children of Joseph were 2 tribes, Manasseh and Ephraim. And we look at where Ephraim gets, where that tribe settled there. And they gave no part to the Levites in the land except cities to dwell in. We talked about that. And with the common land, we talked about that. And so as the Lord had commanded Moses, so the children of Israel did, and they divided the land there. So we've talked about those areas there. Now, question number 4 there talks about what was given to Caleb. I'm going to get it right this time, Mary. What was given to Hebron. Okay. Caleb got Hebron there. And, okay, somebody tell me who Caleb was. And we're running behind, so we'll finish up right there. Who was Caleb? Okay.
The only other spy that wanted to go forward and wasn't afraid.
All right.
Tribe of Judah.
Very, very important there. We're talking about Caleb then was one of the spies that Moses had sent in, and he came back with positive information. So we'll talk about that because it also gives some time elements still there. So we'll pick up with Joshua 14 next week, and didn't quite get as far as I wanted to. We have next week, we'll chapter on the 11th, we'll have regular study. But on April the 18th, our Bible study will be Gary Jones will be here. Gary will be here on April the 18th. And so, again, keep that in mind. Thank you so much.